Fly fishing is not like other kinds of fishing. Fly fishermen call any other kind of fishing conventional fishing. And in conventional rod and reel fishing, you are casting or throwing a bait or a lure, and the weight of the bait or the lure is what allows you to throw it and cast it where you want it to go. This is not how you cast a fly rod. In fly fishing, the weight of the fly itself is negligible. It's inconsequential. It weighs nothing. The fly itself doesn't have enough mass to be cast anywhere. In fly fishing, you actually cast the fly line. The fly line is the weighted thing, and the leader, which is tied to the fly, is attached to that fly line. And so the momentum of the line is what takes the leader and the fly ultimately where you want it to go. This, as you might imagine, is many degrees more complicated than just throwing a weighted bait or lure out there. Fly casting is rhythm and poetry, and there's an art to it, to casting a fly line that requires your whole body and the rhythm of the line to be kind of in sync and in tune and in time with one another. It is really, really easy to do it poorly. And it is much more challenging and a lifetime pursuit to do it excellently. The first time I went saltwater fly fishing was in the Gulf of Mexico, in a place called the Biloxi Marsh, which is just south of Louisiana in the Gulf. We were targeting a species of fish called redfish, which are common down here. But before we got to the Biloxi Marsh, my guide stops the boat in the middle of nowhere and tells me to cast. And I say, like at what? He says, doesn't matter. I need to see what I'm working with. This is what the guide said. I need to see what I'm working with. I need to see how good you are at casting, because that's going to determine the position I put you in. Your ability to cast is going to determine where we're able to fish or not, because of how proficient you might be. It was going to be hard work for him to get me on fish that day. There are many different casting techniques in fly fishing. Various types of casts where you can manipulate the fly line in different ways so that the leader and the fly itself can wind up where you want it to be. And you do those casts based on which direction the wind is going, kind of how the water might be flowing. If you have a lot of stuff behind you, will all determine different casting techniques so that you can effectively land the fly where you need it to land. Successful fly anglers master these techniques. They are capable at any moment to successfully make the kind of cast that is required in each circumstance. When I was in Scotland not long ago, I asked my guide, Danny, who we met in our first lecture, about being successful on the water. And what he said was, this is the first thing to being successful in the water. He introduced that to me, and he talked about casting. And this is what he told me.
Easy questions. First, learn how to cast. Definitely. Because how successful you are can a lot of the time be linked to your ability to cast. If you can't cast, your chances are reduced significantly, irrespective of how good the guide is. And good guides will teach you how to cast, or you get cast instructions before a big holiday. Don't wait until you get there, because it means that you will spend less time learning how to fish and more time actually fishing. But good casting, and it's something that I see a lot, good casters catch fish. It's as simple as that. If you're a good caster and you get a good guide to show you where the fish are and help you, you're going to catch fish.
Danny said how successful you are will be linked to your ability to cast. Good casters catch fish. I took a trip to Iceland, and the first day we were fishing on a lake there in Iceland, and the wind blew so hard the whole time. The winds there were blowing about 25 to 35 to 30 miles an hour. Very difficult fishing conditions because you're using light equipment, light flies, and when you have wind going that fast. At this particular lake, the wind had pushed all of the bug life and the bait to one part of the lake, which meant all the fish were sort of here. But the only way to access them was staring dead into a 25 to 30 mile an hour headwind. And I had been in that situation before, and I did not have the ability to do it. However, the great thing about these fish is they were maybe only 15 to 20 feet offshore. You could see these big, beautiful brown trout right there. And so the guide is like, all right, we found them. This is the right fly. Put it right out there in front of them. And literally, the fly line would just go straight behind me. And I was trying to cast into this headwind. And not only was I unsuccessful in even getting a fly to land 20 feet away from me, but it was literally landing behind me on the shore. And it was deeply embarrassing. And my guide, his name was Mirosh. He said, Scott, we are not going to leave here until we figure this out. And so he took me to a different part of the lake, and he gave me a casting lesson that I'll never forget, and worked with me for the better part of an hour until I learned the rhythm and how to produce the kind of speed that will allow that line to cut through the wind to land the fly where I need it to. And at a certain point, he said, you've got it. And we went over there, and I caught the largest brown trout I'd ever seen in person. But making the cast, and this is important, this is what I want us to get, making the cast is not about the fly. Making the cast really is about the fly line. You can have the right fly, but if you can't make the cast to get it where it needs to go, then it doesn't matter, because the fly follows the fly line. And as we talk about sharing the gospel with people, making the cast is not about what we say to them. It's not about the words that we use. Making the cast is about what we show them. It's about how it is we exhibit the love and grace of Jesus Christ to them in a way that they can see and experience. It's a way that validates to them the Jesus we'll wind up talking about. This is what Jesus means when he says in Matthew chapter 5, when he says, you are the light of the world. A city set on a hill can't be hidden, nor do people light a lamp and put it under a basket, but they put it on a stand, and it gives light to all who are in the house. In the same way, let your light shine before others, so that what? So that they can see your good works and give glory to your Father who is in heaven. People will see us before they hear us. What they see in us will either validate or disqualify what they hear from us. There's an often uttered phrase in Christian circles that we are to love the sinner and hate the sin. That's dumb. That idea is embraced by people who do a much better job of the second part than they do the first part. Loving the sinner is the first casting lesson. I would argue that we need to love the sinner and let Jesus deal with the sin in them. How we love people, how we exhibit God's grace to those around us, how we care for them, how we meet their felt needs, how we sacrifice for and serve others is the cast. It is how we reach them ultimately with the gospel. It is the means through which we can present the gospel to them in a way that they understand, because they've already experienced what it looks like and what it feels like and the way that we've lived and the way that we've loved. The fly of the gospel in word follows the fly line of the gospel in love. The fly of the gospel in word follows the fly line of the gospel in love. What they see in us will prepare them for what they hear from us. The philosopher Aristotle talked about 3 keys to successful communication. He proposed that what became known as the Aristotelian rhetorical triangle, kind of Aristotle's keys to successful communication. Aristotle said that one important component of effective communication is a Greek word logos. Logos is the truth of what we're saying, right? The actual word. Logos has to do with factual details. He says, effective communication involves communicating true things. For instance, Jesus Christ died on a Roman cross on a Friday and rose from the dead on a Sunday 3 days later. That's Logos. It's a statement of fact. This happened. This is where it happened. This is when it happened. Aristotle proposed, though, that pathos was another essential component to effective communication. Pathos has to do with emotional content, how what we say makes people feel, not just what it makes them think or know. Logos helps people know something. Pathos helps people feel something. In communication, pathos is why Logos matters. Jesus Christ died on a Roman cross on a Friday because God loved us so much that He sent His Son in our place to pay with His own life the penalty of our sin. He rose from the dead on a Sunday 3 days later. So not only could we be forgiven our sin, but we get to share in this new life eternally as God's redeemed people. That's how much He loves us. Logos, a statement of fact. Who, what, when, where. Pathos, why He did it, a motivating emotion. Two essential components to effective communication. But the last element of Aristotle's rhetorical method, he argues, is the most essential element of effective communication. You can have all the Logos, you can have all the pathos, but if you don't have this third component, the Logos and the pathos won't matter to people. He said the third component of effective communication is ethos. Ethos is character, the character of the person who is speaking. Does that person's character line up with the message that they're telling me so that I care enough that it's true, so that I can validate what it is making me feel? For instance, Adolf Hitler could give a book report on Dale Carnegie's How to Win Friends and Influence People. But would it matter? Right? He could give us factual information about the book. He could share how that book changed his life. But it's not going to matter to us one bit. Why? Because he was a horrible and hateful person. Logos and pathos only matter to the degree that ethos backs it up. So the question for us becomes, as gospel sharers, is our life marked by the gospel we share? Not just do we know it as far as its content, but is our life shaped by the same gospel that we're proclaiming? Do we look like the gospel we're sharing? Do we look and love like Jesus? Is it His light they see in us before we say a thing? That will validate what it is that we're saying or invalidate it. We need to ask, is the grace that we model consistent with the grace that I'm proclaiming? Because if we model something less than the grace and love of Jesus, all the Logos and pathos of our knowledge, all the scriptures that we've memorized, it won't overcome the lack of evidence of it in our lives. And because it lacks that ethos, it won't matter to people. There's a really cool picture of this concept that we read in the scriptures in Acts chapter 2. It's a picture of the very first church, the very first community of Christians in the whole entire world. It was a church that was growing like gangbusters. People were coming to know Jesus at an alarming rate. It was really exciting. And Luke describes this in Acts 2, 44 through 47. This is what he says. He says, this first church had believers who were together and had all things in common. And they sold their possessions and belongings and distributed the proceeds to all as anybody had need. And day by day, attending the temple and breaking bread in their homes, they received their food with glad and generous hearts, praising God and having the favor of all the people. And the Lord added to their number daily those who were being saved. Sounds like it'd be an awesome church to be a part of. What we need to see is that because of what Jesus was doing in them, they were becoming selfless and caring people. They were exhibiting the generosity and joy of the Lord in their manner of life. Their lives looked like Jesus' own life in the way that He welcomed people, in the way that He gave Himself to them. And it says in verse 47 that because the church was shining like that, because it was looking like Jesus, it says they had the favor of all the people. That people inside the church and outside the church looked at these believers and said, that's awesome. What's fascinating is that word favor in the Greek is the word charis, which 75% of the time it's used in the Bible is translated as the word grace. It's the word for grace. They lived grace toward one another, and therefore people viewed them with grace. In other words, they were exhibiting the grace of Christ, and people wanted to experience that grace. The grace they lived underscored the gospel that they preached, and because of that, God added to their number daily those who were being saved. Their life together validated the testimony of their preaching. How you exhibit the Jesus you know in the way that you live is the best way for people to want to know more about what He's done in your life and what He can do in their life. Therefore, a vital component of this is our own discipleship, our own growth in grace, our own sanctification as the Lord shapes us to look more and more like Him. Because that is ultimately going to be the validity of our testimony. You can have all the facts and figures about what God did for the world in Jesus Christ. And if your life doesn't look like a person who has been shaped and transformed by that, it's going to fall on deaf ears. The compassion of Jesus is how we make the cast. The compassion of Jesus is the fly line that allows us to effectively deliver the truth of the gospel. There's a fascinating story from church history. Historian Eusebius writes about a plague that went through the city of Caesarea in the 4th century. And everybody was fleeing Caesarea. Just because a plague had broke out, a lot of people getting sick, a lot of people dying. Everybody was getting out of Caesarea, except the people who were sick and except the Christians. They stayed behind to care for the orphans and the sick. And Emperor Julian at the time, the Roman emperor, was a pagan. And there was a systemic extermination of the Christian religion out of the Roman Empire. And so Emperor Julian wrote to one of his governors to see how the extermination of Christianity was going in the regions that this governor oversaw. And word got back to Emperor Julian that Christianity was still growing and thriving. And so Julian writes this letter to his governor, and he wants to know why. Why in the world, with all this energy and effort at extinguishing the church, why are you telling me that it's growing? With all the persecution and the execution of Christians, how could this be the case? The governor wrote back to the emperor what he saw. And he recorded that the Christians didn't leave when everybody else did. And this is a quote in the letter. He said, he sent word to Julian and said, the Christians grow because they support not only their poor, but ours as well. They were exhibiting grace. They didn't leave when it got hard, but they stayed and loved people that people stopped loving. And the gospel thrived. Day by day, the Lord added to their number daily those who were being saved because of the gospel they exhibited. It backed up the gospel that they preached. The Apostle Peter would write to suffering Christians in the 1st century. He says this, increased persecution on the church was putting pressure on Christians. And so he would write this in chapter 3 of his first letter, Peter would. He says, in your hearts honor Christ the Lord as holy, always being prepared to make a defense to anyone who asks you for the reason for the hope that is in you. Yet do it with gentleness and respect, having a good conscience, so that when you are slandered, those who revile your good behavior in Christ may be put to shame. What's he saying? Peter's saying that the way we suffer with hope, the way we suffer with the hope of the gospel will have people demanding to know where that comes from. Why are you the way you are? So he says, be ready. Because the way we suffer is going to be a visual example of the gospel, and people are going to know why it is this is happening in us. Why in the midst of this hardship are we not crushed? Why in light of what's happening politically are we not more scared or angry? How we're not completely downtrodden in light of a harsh diagnosis? Tell me the source of this ethos in you that shines like light in the midst of darkness. Peter says that's going to happen when we live this way, and so be ready for that. Peter says we need to live in such a way that people who slander you will seem like they are crazy because of how gracious and loving we are. He says people are going to want to slander you, and it's going to be burning coals on their head because you will be unslanderable. You will have a good conscience. You will simply be loving and gracious toward people. So he says, live in such a way that when you do need to say hard things to people living under the weight of sin, there will be no question about your compassion. That will be coming from a place of love. This reminds me of another good biblical illustration of the same principle with Paul and Silas, who were in a crazy story, kind of falsely accused of some stuff, and they were thrown in prison. And they weren't writhing in anger, lawyering up, accusing Rome of injustice. In Acts 16, we read that about midnight, Paul and Silas were praying and singing hymns to God in prison, shackled and chained. And the other prisoners were listening to them. And suddenly there was a violent earthquake that the foundations of the prison were shaken. And at once the prison doors flew open, everyone's chains came loose, and the jailer woke up. And when he saw that the prison doors were open, he drew his sword and was about to kill himself because he thought the prisoners had escaped. But Paul shouted, "Don't harm yourself, man. We're right here." And the jailer called for lights and rushed in and fell trembling before Paul and Silas. And then he brought them out and asked, "Sirs, what must I do to be saved?" Paul and Silas, falsely imprisoned, were singing and praying at midnight in this midst of this hard time. In a moment, this jailer, when he thought he'd done a bad job, was ready to end his life. And he saw in Paul and says, whatever that is in you that gives you hope in the midst of this difficulty, I need that. And so they replied, "Believe in the Lord Jesus and you will be saved, you and your household." In other words, he saw the grace in Paul and Silas, and then they had an opportunity to share the gospel. Then they spoke the word of the Lord to him and all the others in his house. In that hour of night, the jailer took them and washed their wounds, and immediately he and his household were baptized. The jailer brought them into his house and set a meal before them, and he was filled with joy because he had come to believe in God, he and his whole household. Why? Because Paul and Silas were singing and praying at midnight. And this jailer, in the worst moment of his life, wanted to know what was in them making them do that. That gave them opportunity to share the gospel. And the jailer said, "I want it, and I want it all. I want that in my life." It was their character, not their preaching, that first compelled the jailer to discover what they had that he was missing. It is through the ordinary means of grace that we learn to cast. It is through allowing our lives to be shaped by God's Word, being in Christian fellowship and community through our worship. It is in these ordinary means that God shapes our lives to look more and more and more like Jesus, so that what they see in us is what they hear from us. We proclaim the gospel first in how we exhibit God's grace. We proclaim the gospel first in how we exhibit God's grace. That's how we cast the line. And the fly follows it. I had a friend in college that I knew before I became a Christian, and we continued to go to school together. His father, before I knew him, when he was in high school, his father had been killed in a carjacking. He was hurting. He was an alcoholic. He was a cocaine addict. He was angry. He was miserable. He was just really, really angry. After I came to, and he and I would hang out, and then I became a Christian. And my life began to change, and I wasn't as miserable or as lost as I had been. And he would come to my dorm room, drunk, multiple times, and just storm in angry. "Why are you the way you are? And don't give me that Jesus stuff. Like, why are you the way you are?" I said, "Man, that's all I got to give. That's the only difference. Is I had an encounter with the grace of God and Jesus Christ, and it has changed my life." About a year and a half later, he stood in my dorm room and finally relented. "Why are you the way you are? Brother, there is one reason, and his name is Jesus." And he and I were able to pray in the middle of that dorm room as he gave his life to the Lord. But it was It was not my preaching that did it. It was what he saw God do in my life that made him want to know what it was. And finally, he relented to receive the only answer I had to give him, that Jesus Christ died to save sinners, of whom I am the foremost. And he transformed my life, and he can transform yours too. We will be effective fishers of men when our life of grace and love allow us to reach people with that long before they hear us share a word. How we love them well will validate what we wind up telling them about what God has done for them in Jesus Christ. That's how we make the cast.